Hey class, today we are going to move on and talk about factoring quadratics in order to solve. It's really similar to our last lesson where we set them equal to 0, but they were already in factored form. Today we are going to be doing the same thing. We'll just have to factor first in order to solve. So here are the steps. Whenever you have a quadratic in the format ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, you are first going to factor it. And then once we factor, we're going to set each factor equal to 0, because if something times 0, it will equal 0. So that's kind of the idea there. This kind of printed really light, but it says x squared minus 2x minus 3. We want to factor that. That factors to be x minus 3 times x plus 1. So then we'll just take each of those and set them equal to 0. So I would set x minus 3 equal to 0 by itself, and then take x plus 1 and set it equal to 0 by itself. And then just solve each of those equations. So on this one I would add 3 over, so I would get x equals 3. On this one I would subtract 1 over to the other side, so I'd get negative 1 as my answers. So we're going to walk through some problems like that. So first factor it and then set it equal to 0, which is what we call the zero product property. So remember, when we are factoring, we're going to do the factor by grouping method. If there's not a number out in front, this is like a 1 in the front, but you're going to take the first number and times it by the last number. So in this case, 1 times 36 is just 36. And I like to do this little X chart. So the number that you multiply goes in the top, and then the number from the middle goes in the bottom. And you're thinking, what two numbers would multiply to be 36 but add to be 12? So for 36, 6 times 6 is 36, but 6 plus 6 is 12. So then we take both of these numbers and we split up our middle term into a 6x and a 6x, and then keep the 1x squared in the front, and then keep the plus 36 in the back. And then once you have your 4 terms, you can group them into 2 groups, and then we take out the greatest common factor. So for the first group, x squared plus 6x, we can take an x away from both. So if I take an x away, I'm left with x plus 6 inside. And then for 6x plus 36, there's a 6 in common. So if I take a 6 out, I'm left with x, and then 36 divided by 6 is 6. And just a reminder, these should match. So since they're both x plus 6, that means we did it right. So then to write our answer, we take one of these. I'm gonna write it over here. And then you take the 2 parts out in front, which happen to be an x and a 6 as well. And then this is our factored format, but now we do our zero product property, which means set each factor equal to 0 by itself, and then solve. And on this one we have the same factor twice, but we would minus 6 over and we'd get x equals negative 6, which will happen also over here, but we don't need to write it 2 times, so we just have one answer. And then there are some shortcuts that you can do through here. I am just going to show all of the steps every time just to make sure everyone understands what we are doing. But if you feel like you can go from here to here without doing that work, you're welcome to. Again, this is a 1 in the front of this one. So I'm going to do 1 times 66, which is 66. And think what multiplies to be 66 but adds to be a negative 17. So let's be careful with our signs here because this one is negative. So I need 2 numbers that times to be 66 but add to be a negative 17. So that would be negative 11 and negative 6. And since they're both negative, when I times them, they turn to a positive 66. But when I add the 2 negatives, they stay in negative 17. So then we split up our negative 17 into a negative 11x and a negative 6x. Keep the x squared in the front and the 66 in the back. And then we're going to put them into our 2 groups. Make sure to bring the negative in with this one. And then again, just repeat by taking the common factor out of each group. So for x squared and negative 11x, all we can do is take an x out, which leaves us with 1x minus 11. And then for negative 6x plus 66, remember when this one's negative, we don't like this first term to be negative. So we're going to take out a negative with it and a 6. And taking that negative out is going to switch both of the signs. So this will turn to a positive x, and 66 divided by -6 will turn to a -11. But we needed to do that in order to get our signs to match on the inside here. So we have our matching x minus 11, x minus 11. So we're going to keep that and then take the parts out front, x minus 6, set it equal to 0. And then to do your zero product property, you're just going to set each one equal to 0 by itself. So for this one, all we'd have to do is add 11 over, and we get x equals 11. So there's one answer. And then for x minus 6, we would add the 6. So those cancel, and we get x equals 6. So those are your two answers. Again, you can do the shortcut and come over here. The shortcut only works though if this is a 1x squared out in front. But if you do notice, this -11 and this -6 kind of just go right into here. So you have x minus 11, x minus 6, and then you switch the signs and you get x equals positive 11 and x equals positive 6. But again, that shortcut only works if it's a 1x squared in front. If there's another number in the front of x squared, you can't do it that way. So if we do the shortcut on this one, again, it only works if there's a 1x squared in the front. I do 1 times -14 is still just -14. And I think what multiplies to be -14 but adds to be -5. The signs on this one are kind of tricky, so be careful with that. 7 and 2 make 14, but in order for it to add to be a -5, we want -7 and +2. So when I times those, -7 times 2 is -14, but -7 plus 2 is -5. But again, with the shortcut, since it's a 1x squared, you can just skip the factor by grouping and go straight into your factored parts, where you're going to have x minus a 7, x plus a 2, and then you're going to set each of those equal to 0, which you can even do a shortcut here, because if this is x minus 7, I end up adding 7, so my answer becomes x equals positive 7. So the sign just switches for your answer. So if this is x plus 2, I know my answer is going to be -2. So there are lots of shortcuts you can do as you get more comfortable with factoring. But remember, those shortcuts work only if it's a 1x squared out front. Okay, sometimes you will get equations like this where the number is over on the other side of the equal sign. You have to have it equal to 0 before you can solve. So this one would be one where if you were going too quick, you would just start factoring it. But really, we don't want a -3 over here. We need to add it over to the other side. So your first step would be to set equal to 0. So in order to do that, we would get rid of this -3 by adding 3 to each side, so that I get x squared minus 4x plus 3 equals 0. And then now we would factor for step 2. So factoring, we do have the nice 1x squared in front, so we can do the shortcut, where you do 1 times 3 is 3, so that goes on the top. We think what multiplies to be 3 but adds to be that middle number, -4. So 3 is kind of easy because the only two numbers you can use are 3 and 1. But because this is a -4, we want it to be a -3 and a -1. So since it is a 1x squared, we can do the shortcut where we just take both of these numbers and we plug them into our parentheses. So we get an x minus a 3 and an x minus a 1 equal to 0. And then now you do your zero product property, where you would set each equal to 0 and solve from there. So on this one, we would add 3 over. So we get x equals positive 3 as an answer. And this one you would add 1 over, so that we get x equals positive 1. And those are your two answers. But just make sure if there's a number on the other side of the equal sign, you need to move it over, and we have to have it equal to 0 in order to do the problem. Sometimes they'll just tell you to solve with, but if it says to solve, it just means to factor and use zeros. They might not necessarily tell you to do this step. They'll just say solve, but no, when they say that, that's what it means to do. Here's a trickier one. Notice that this -98 is on the right side of that equal sign. We want this to be 0. So before I do anything, I need to move that over to the other side, so that I have 2x squared minus 28x plus 98 equals 0. And then also notice we do have that 2x squared, so we can't do the shortcut when there is a 2 in the front. But we do have a common factor. All of these numbers are even, so I could actually factor that 2 out first to make these numbers a little bit smaller. And doing that will just make the problem a little bit easier. So if I take a 2 away from this, I'm left with a 1x squared. 28 divided by 2 will give us a negative 14x. And then 98 divided by 2 is 49. And that just makes the problem a little bit easier, because now if I factor it, because I took this 2 out front, I now have a 1x squared. So I can do the easier shortcut way of factoring, where I do 1 times 49 is 49. And I think what multiplies to be that, but adds to be the middle number, negative 14. And so for 49, we can do 7 times 7 is 49. But because this is a negative 14, we want to make both of these negative. So negative 7 plus negative 7 is negative 14. But it still works for the multiplying, because a negative times a negative turns positive. So we can take both of these and plug them in. So we have x minus 7, x minus 7. But remember, there's a 2 out front still, equals 0. So when you do your zero product property, remember we're solving for x. So since this 2 is just a 2, it doesn't really do anything when we're solving. There's not an x with it. So we kind of just ignore it, and we're still just worrying about the x minus 7s. So if I set each of these equal to 0, which I really only need to do 1 time, I would just add the 7 over, and I would get x equals 7 as my answer. And we don't need to write that twice. We can just write it 1 time. And the 2 just kind of goes away. We don't need to worry about it since there's not an x on it. Okay, let's try another one. Again, we see there's a number on the wrong side, so we need to move it over. So let's subtract the 21 over, so that I get 3x squared minus 2x minus 21 equals 0. This time though, I don't have a common factor. 3 doesn't go into all of these, neither does 2. So we're kind of stuck with this one. We won't be able to do the shortcuts. So when there is a number out front, we still are going to take the first number, which is a 3 this time, and times it to the back number. So 3 times 21, negative 21, is a negative 63. Then we think what multiplies to be negative 63, but adds to be negative 2. So then we want to think of our factors for 63, which is 9 and 7. And so we do have some negatives here though, so we need to think which one would have the negative on it. So since it's a negative 2, we want the bigger number to be negative. So that way negative 9 plus 7 gives us a negative 2. But because we have the 3 in the front this time, we can't just skip and do our shortcut. We actually need to do our factor by grouping, where we're going to split this middle term into 2 parts with our negative 9 and our 7. So I'm going to do a negative 9x and a 7x. Remember to put those x's on it. Keep the 3x squared in the front and the negative 21 in the back. And then now we can do our 2 groups and take out our common factor. So for 3x squared minus 9x, 3 goes into both numbers, and we can also take an x out, so a 3x. 3x squared divided by 3x is x, and negative 9x divided by 3x is a negative 3. And then now let's do our second group. For 7x and negative 21, there's a 7 in common. So if I divide each of these by 7, I get x minus 3. Again, your check is to make sure these match, which they do, so we're good. So we're going to take one matching group, and then the 2 parts in the front go into their own group. So there's the factored form, but now we have to do the zero product property. We're not done yet. So you're going to take each of these and set them equal to 0. This one's nice and easy. All you have to do is add the 3 over, and we get x equals 3. But this one, we do have some extra numbers. We have a 3x instead of just an x. So remember your order of operations. First, we want to get rid of that plus 7 by subtracting it. And so we get 3x equals a negative 7, but now we want to get rid of the 3 by dividing by 3. So we get x is equal to a negative 7/3. So those would be your 2 answers for this problem. Okay. Let's do one more example and then we'll be done. So we have 5x squared plus 6x equals a -1. So again, we have the number on the wrong side of the equal sign. So before we can factor, we need to add that 1 to the other side so that those cancel. And I have a 5x squared plus 6x plus 1 equals 0. We need to have that 0 on one side. Now we can factor it. So I don't have anything in common that I can take out first. So we're just going to have to jump in and do 5 times 1, which is 5. And then add to be the middle number 6. Well, the only two numbers that times be 5 are 5 and 1. And 5 plus 1 is 6. So we're going to take both of these numbers. And we have to do our factor by grouping this time. I'm going to split it up to a 5x and a 1x. You can write the 1 if you want. You don't really need to, though. Keep the 5x squared out front and the plus 1 in the back. And then we can do our two groups of 2. So for this group, it's kind of easy to see. The common factor would be a 5 and 1x we can take out. So if I take out a 5x, I'm left with x plus 1. So 5x divided by 5x is 1, so don't forget to put that. Sometimes I have students, when this happens, leave the spot blank because I think it just goes away. But remember, it's like we're dividing, and 5x divided by 5x is 1. Anything divided by itself equals 1, so don't forget that 1 placeholder. And then on this one, if I look at x plus 1, they don't have anything in common. It's just an x and a 1. So when that happens, your common factor is just a 1, and you just keep the x plus 1. So these match, that means we did it right. We're going to keep one of the x plus 1s. And then the 5x and the 1 come into their own group. And remember, this is all still equal to 0. So now we're not done. We still need to solve it by doing our 0 product property. So I'm going to take x plus 1 and set it equal to 0. So to solve for x, I would need to get rid of that plus 1 by subtracting 1. Those cancel, and I get x equals -1. And then for the 5x plus 1, set that equal to 0. First, I would need to minus the 1 over. And I get 5x equals a -1. And then now to get rid of the 5, we divide by 5. So we do get a fraction, and we get a -1/5. So our two answers would be -1 and -1/5. So there is solving with factoring first. Be careful again on the ones that have the number on the wrong side. You need to get 0 over there first. And then just pay attention to if the number in front of your trinomial, if it's not a 1, you do need to do your factor by grouping. If it is just a 1x squared, you can skip some steps and kind of do it the easier way. But go ahead and get started on your homework. It'll just be on Math Excel, and it'll just be 3.3 for Math Excel. So go ahead and log on and get going. Hope you guys are doing well, and I'll see you soon.